Well, let me welcome you for the seminar today. Actually, this is our last normal seminar because the next two will be devoted to PhD students and they will present their work. So in this sense, it's normal. In a certain sense, it's not that normal because I think it is the first time when we will face political discourse. I mean, so I think this is an issue which is discussed among us and other people, and I'm really happy to be able to welcome our two colleagues, Jan Kubik from the Rutgers University and Jiří Kocián, the local Malach person from our institute. So I will not just have your time. It's your time, and please start.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. So thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having us. Thank you for coming. This is a project which is under development. I wouldn't say it's an early stage, but it's somewhere on the road. I don't know, 30% travel, maybe more, hard to say. And it is what we will be presenting today is a part of a larger project in which we hope to produce as a book of some size. So I will give you first a very short introduction to the whole project, and then we will increasingly be moving towards the part that is of particular interest for this seminar, I suppose. So what we are planning to do is a few observations on the Czech and Polish populisms, definition of populism, which is some issue of considerable debate in the literature. Existing explanations, which is the beginning of our exact topic, explanations of, and the question will be, as you will see, of what? There are many different things one wants to explain about the rise of populism. Then a quote from a famous anthropologist, Arjuna Padurai, who grasped something, as you will see, very important, to which we are trying to provide an answer. And our main objective is to reconstruct semantic networks detected in people's minds. Our method is interpretive-structural coding and semantic network analysis based on our own interviews. And then you will see we have a bunch of preliminary results. So at the beginning, we know a few things. There's been quite a bit written about those two populisms in two countries that are friendly neighbors, yet completely different in many respects. Of course, similar in others. So in the literature, the Czech populism, the most common name used is technocratic populism, which indicates a certain degree of pragmatism, particularly compared with Poland, which has this kind of crazy Catholic, nationalistic, messianic, what I call messianic populism. And we are trying to understand not only the differences between them on the level of discourse produced by various politicians and various, as we say these days, influencers, but Catholic priests, for example, in Poland, and also on the level of people's minds aggregated in a specific way. This information you will see we base it on our interviews, but not only, we are relying on existing surveys also. The differences between the situation of those two countries by now is considerable. While the Czech Republic is still considered by Freedom House and other ranking agencies a consolidated democracy, Poland is already a semi-consolidated democracy after 8 years of PiS's rule. So PiS Law and Justice Party, this will be the name that will be popping up a lot because that's the dominant carrier of the Polish version of populism, although not the only one. If you look at it over time, so just last 10 years, you have here 4 countries. Orange is Czechia, the black line is Poland, the blue is Hungary. So of course, Hungary is sliding away from democracy at the faster pace, and it's deeper than Poland. But the exemplar, the leader in the region, the post-communist region, is Estonia. So something is going on, and of course, by now the difference between the positions of the Czech Republic and Poland are of considerable interest to quite a few people. If you take the placement of the major carriers of populism, so this is ANO on the two-dimensionals, in a two-dimensional, on the plane, left, right, mostly economically, and the scale that is now used broadly in political science. GAL-TAN, GAL stands for Green Alternative Libertarian, TAN stands for Traditional Authoritarian Nationalistic. So this is where ANO is. Please keep this in mind. And then you look at Poland, you see where the piece is. It's quite in this corner, whereas ANO, remember, was around here. And this is PO, platform, a civic platform, a party in Poland which is regarded as sort of liberal, conservative, but very centrist. This is the carrier of that anti-peace revolution that happened in the fall of 23, and right-wing populists were, i.e. peace, were kicked out of power by a party which is close, actually, on this dimension, at least on those 2 dimensions, to ANO. What is populism? I have no time. Oh, I didn't start my timer. To give you the whole review of the existing conceptions, we follow, I've been running those projects now for several years. The definition which is introduced by Kaz Mude and developed by us in the project a bit, which is an ideational definition. So we take populism to be a form of ideology. We claim that it has 2 versions, thin and thick. Thin has 4 features, thick has 5. And they, in a moment, you will see how we're dealing with the problem of, do they all have to be present? Can they be partially present? This is really those questions are driving this endless debate, what is populism, which I think we have an interesting solution to this debate. So the essence of politics, number 1, is vertical polarization, the people versus the elite. The relationship between those 2 homogeneous entities is antagonism. The whole construct has what people call the Manichaean tenor, i.e. Manichaeism is the religion which privileges in its vision the conflict between the forces good and evil. So there's some kind of language that this conflict is really a conflict of kind of almost a metaphysical level between the forces of good and evil. Some populists use it more than others. Kaczynski in Poland uses it a lot, actually. Trump is using it all the time, as you know, and Bolsonaro or Erdogan or Modi in India, they all kind of engaged in using this kind of language. And then what is truly important and often missing in the definitions of populism is the insistence of volonté générale. So this is a term that comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau and means this is related to the idea of the sovereignty of the people. But in this version, which is used by the right-wing populists, it simply means I, the leader, I know the will of the people. We don't need institutions. We don't need checks and balances. I will simply take the people to the paradise. I mean, I'm simplifying terribly, but that's the idea. We don't need to bother with all this democratic apparatus that constrains the power of the leader. And if you follow hard not to, I think what Trump is doing at the moment, it is exactly what I mean, well, proportions, but he is moving in this direction, at least tries. Now, populism thickens when the horizontal dimension is added, and the horizontal dimension is the juxtaposition of people, our people, let's call them good people and bad people. So you generate this second dimension of contrast, conflict, rejection. One is vertical against the elite, the other is horizontal against some people who may be of different nationality, different race, different religion, as is the case in India, for example. So an idea occurred to us that it's possible to, if you take a sample or make it bigger or smaller of parties and politicians' statements, some kind of texts, and if you create a code book that some kind of a vocabulary that will assign certain terms to those 5 dimensions, and then if you try to assign the level of intensity, say from 1 to 4, to specific words occurring in the discourse, you will come up, this is fictional, but we haven't done it yet, we're just beginning. You will get the different kind of, as it is called, spider graph of a given populism as a specific type of ideology or discourse. So again, 5 dimensions, and each of them may appear in a specific example case to some degree. So that takes me to the whole definitional war over populism. As you may know, there are at least 3 major ways of defining definitions. One is classical Aristotelian, which is mostly used and pretty dominant. The other one was proposed by Ludwig Wittgenstein, and it is called by him already family resemblances. And then there is the sort of in the middle something they called that comes from linguists, but also others worked in this area, radial definition. In one version of radial definition, radial with the prototype, you have a prototype. The moment I saw that, I immediately thought, wow, I know it from somewhere. This is Max Weber's ideal type, the idea of ideal type. It has something to do. That's a similar, I think, intuition. So the prototype has five elements, right, that I mentioned earlier, and they will all be in the prototype at their maximum value. Let's assume that they range from 0 to 1. And then those are fictional numbers at the moment. Each specific populist, perhaps for a specific period of time, maybe for a specific types of speeches. I mean, all of this is, of course, a bit more complicated. They should differ on each of those dimensions. In other words, on each dimension, each of them will be departing from the prototype to some degree. This way of defining assumes that you can have a 0, because I guess then you have to say you have additive method of aggregating those partial scores, because of course if you would be multiplying, then 0 would bring 0 to the whole. There would be no populism. So this is something, the definitional part, it's, we thought we want to share it with you because this is something that is, that we are just proposing, so it will be interesting to hear what you think. Simply the move from classical to radial definition, that's the essence of it. Second issue, huge area of work, is explanations. So without going into the details, there are some, by now, seminal works. One of them produced by Norris and Engelhardt, who observed that there are three types of explanations of the rise of populism, both left and right, but particularly right. Number one, the demand side of public opinion. And here the question is, what is driving this change in public opinion? Or are those economic factors or cultural factors? So economy versus culture. The supply side of party strategies. There is a change in the way the political field of parties is structured, and the characteristics of different parties changed over time. And then finally, constitutional arrangements have impact on it, as many people have shown. It's enough to think about presidential versus parliamentary systems. Things will play, of course, differently. We are concentrating on the demand side of public opinion, mostly, not only. And here, as I said, there are two theses. One is economic, you can call it economic inequality thesis, and the other is cultural backlash thesis. Several people, particularly Engelhardt and Norris and people who followed in their footsteps, show that it is mostly cultural factors without eliminating economic factors. But in various ways they studied. In their case, they based their studies on a relatively large database, not without problems, of the World Values Survey, which is the biggest survey in the world. And then they, that's the conclusion. Now, dominant explanations on the demand side are based on attitudinal surveys. We think that they have three shortcomings, like all studies based on study of attitudes. Number one, survey research does not deal with the origins or sources of attitudes. You know, I always go to presentations by people who present the survey result, and I say, where do those attitudes come from? And usually people say, oh, I haven't studied it yet. I said, okay, well, so let's go to work and let's try to figure it out. Number two, survey of attitudes do not have much to say about the meaning of objects of attitudes. They are about some kind of directionality, support, emotion, liking, and things like that. And finally, so let me show you just very quickly the very basic sort of presentation on attitudes. The attitudes usually, we would say, have three elements in them: affective, behavioral, and cognitive. But look what I put in red, right? Cognitive component, the opinion or belief segment of an attitude. Opinion or belief. It doesn't say them what. There's nothing here about the meaning. I say if I believe in God versus I do not believe in God, I have no clue how what is God. What those people mean by God, right? If you go to a very influential new study that by a group of economists that confirms the cultural backlash thesis, Margalit and others just published. If you look at I just took one question, because they claim that the most important explanation of the rise of populism is what they call ethnocultural estrangement. People are increasingly feel that something is wrong with their countries, with their cultures, for a variety of reasons. So this is a scale from 0 to 10, and this is the question. Would you say that, say, Czechia's cultural life is generally undermined or enriched by people coming to live here from other countries? 0 indicates worse place to live after they came, and 10 better place to live. There's no question about what is the meaning of those people, us as the people who are those good people, and them. There's no question about meaning of any of this, right? So what comes to the rescue is, of course, a more kind of cognitive side of the psychology, for example. I mean, those who do not just study attitudes, but study, say, cognitive structures, cognitive networks. Having said that, so we want to go to meaning. Some time ago, 2017, Apadurai published an essay on the rise of populism in the world. and said something that is absolutely right on target. Today, leaders and followers do, of course, connect, but this connection is based on an accidental and partial overlap between the ambitions, visions, and strategies of leaders and fears, wounds, and angers of their followers. The leaders who have risen in the new populist movements are typically xenophobic, patriarchal, and authoritarian in their styles. Their followers may share some of these tendencies, but they are also fearful, angry, and resentful of what their societies have done for and to them. Those profiles do, of course, meet, especially in the elections. But this meeting place, that's the phrase that kind of worked on our imagination. The meeting place is not easy to understand. So in the work on anything in politics or anything in social sciences, you have roughly those who produce something, like the meanings, ideas about how to feel about something and so on, and those who, at least for a moment, analytically we have to make this move, are on the receiving side. Their minds are being shaped. So they're shapers and those whose minds are being shaped. The literature talks about the supply and demand side. We have no doubt that it is a constant, complex game between demand and supply, or supply and demand, and we're studying both sides. But here we want to focus on the demand side. So it is just a fragment of a kind of more complex graph that we could present on, what needs to be explained and how, but say that we want to explain causes of support for populism. Well, here you have political and economic and cultural, here is cultural coming from this side, explanations. Cultural supply shapes people's minds, people choose populists, say. Another thing that we want to explain, and this is for this project, which is much less frequent, is features of populism. Why is the Czech populist so different than Polish populists, right? So that's the kind of question that's driving all of this. But first, we look at cultural demand side. What is in those cultures that possibly provides an explanation? So our interest is what is the relationship between a set of public discourses, so-called national culture, on supply side, and people's thinking, demand side. Both dimensions of culture have semantic network properties. The meaning of each element depends on its position in the network. That's some basics. Key assumption: individual minds are shaped, however imperfectly, by public network discursive fields. People exist in a specific fields, and that those fields are different in the Czech Republic than they are in Poland and Hungary and so on. So our task for semantic network analysis is determine how much similarity exists between networks of meaning detectable in individual minds. It is an aggregative exercise, right? We ask people in the interviews, they give us text, answering questions, and we analyze those texts and then try to see patterns. You could say that some literature talks about communities of discourse. So our methods: data collection, in that what recently has been called interpretive interviewing. It is interested, the interest of the interviewer is how people interpret the world. It is more about how they think about the world than about the truth of the, say, or factuality of their representation of the world. Data analysis, one, interpretive structural coding that generates code co-occurrence networks, CCNs. You wouldn't be scientific if you wouldn't use some acronyms. And then semantic network analysis, another acronym, SNA. All right, so we will take you step by step. We will say very little about the interviews. We can return to that if you have questions. So we had two ethnographers employed for a year during the COVID pandemic. So COVID is obviously in the background of the whole study. We couldn't escape it. It just happened. It was both useful and not so useful. It terribly interrupted our work. We had to move interviewing completely online for a period of time and so on. But they managed to do 113 interviews, very long interviews. Roughly, that's the distribution of age and our determination of their political orientations. They are kind of all over the place, but in a very general sense, the sort of left and right is somewhat balanced. At least it is not terribly disbalanced. The Polish distribution is somewhat different. It's a little bit more on the social democratic side. But again, here's an assumption, and we're curious what you think about it, that the mental map, people should, there are a lot of sub-communities, but whether someone eventually goes left or right may not be necessarily influencing completely, at least, the way they picture the world, right? Within that picture of the world, they may decide that they are more convinced by left or right. But without the assumption that there is a chance that they share certain things, this method, I guess, would not work at all. And then methods of data analysis, interpretive structural coding. I guess Jirka will take over. I will be interjecting the first. Do you want to take this one or?
Yes, just a little bit of context, how I feel this connects somehow to work of me and other colleagues here at the Institute. We were dealing with a task which is not dissimilar from our general way how we're processing the Holocaust survivors interviews, which is the main core activity of the Malak Center for Visual History. And even recently, working on several projects, we started encountering, I would call it structural issues with different methods of how you can process interviews, specifically through qualitative coding. So what happens, right? Somebody collects an interview, can be video recorded, we can be audio recorded, it can be just a transcript. And then you ask somebody else, could you please sit down and start tagging using qualitative coding to identify important phenomena. And in practice, that's labeling data for further purposes and future usage. And what is basically presented here on this slide is already the first issue of the segmentation, the fragmentation of the long continuous conversation transcribed into text, into analyzable units, right? What we're struggling with a lot in the world of Holocaust survivor interviews is that basically you are confronted with two approaches. One is, I would say, formal, technical, meaning usually one segment for calculating co-occurrence and encoding codes describing phenomena is that you split it minute by time codes, right? Purely formal, and you create this sort of a timeline to represent the issues talked about by the two or more people interacting in an interview. The other approach is normative structuring. People say, okay, there's an episode for childhood. This begins roughly here and ends roughly here. And that becomes a unit of analysis for the purpose of any other idea of mapping networks, right? Because you need a framework, you need a limits of let's say, departure and point of termination of such an episode. So what did we realize that we have with our transcribed interviews and the nature of the interviews at hand is that we have a very good opportunity for natural, as might as we can call it, fragmentation into a set that's composed by a single question and a single answer. This is our unit of analysis, and this is where we take it from there in order to basically mark down what could be the emerging networks. And I don't know, Jan, you may want to discuss the details here of the other visualizations that you presented.
Maybe just one thing, just the essence of the problem is that since we're interested in co-occurrences, right? If someone talks for 20 minutes, but you have several pages of text, then many things will co-occur with many things, and that they will be meaningless in a way, right? Someone talks about cats at the beginning and dogs and the end, and they say they love cats, hate dogs. 10 minutes later, if you code dogs and cats, the edge appears between dogs and cats. Nobody knows what it means. Whereas we assume that this problem is hopefully significantly reduced if we just take one unit, and a smaller unit, which is question answer. And the assumption behind it is, our friend, colleague with whom we started working on it is a mathematician. This is from the piece that we published 2 or 3 years ago. He liked to talk about collective intelligence. I as an anthropologist, well, yeah, okay, whatever, sounds good, but I get the idea that we are assuming that there are certain structures in that people tend to, even if subconsciously, say things together to some degree, right? That they may not be fully aware of the fact that they put those things together, but when you have sufficiently large number of those what is called contributions, then we should get some picture that makes some sense. Okay, so
and
that's
that covers the second dimension of, let's say, ethnography through coding, ethnography of interviews, which is you never get a perfect a product that would be corresponding to the perfect ideal prototype model of the genre. There is a problem of ordering, sorting, jumping, let's say, pre-announcing, ad hoc commenting. So there are all these issues with the sort of linear approach to coding and using whole interview as one unit of analysis, which actually, if you break it down and you want to, because we don't have really big world data, right? We did not scrape 100,000 tweets, which we can't do anymore, but actually we tried in the early phases of the project and try to reproduce this collective intelligence. But because of this qualitative insights that we have, we are aware of the fallacies, right? So that's the first let's say, cornerstone, realizing where do the data come from in terms of the units of analysis. And the second issue is the coding, and that's even worse. I actually had an example, which I don't want to break up the presentation now, but I can tell you, if you go to the Visual History Archive website, the one that is the archive that we're mostly relying on when we're conducting research over the Holocaust survivor interviews, you find a complete thesaurus codebook on the web page, right? And there you basically can look at, first of all, what are the codes, the labels that represent phenomena present in the interviews, but at the same time, you have to realize that this thesaurus is a directed vocabulary that the coders who are manually processing the interviews are using for representing the phenomena. So that's actually, even though it looks like just a simple tool on the side, is a key information about what is basically the mindset of everybody coming into it. The interviewers, the interviewees, the coders, and those who conduct the moderation of the discussion of what codes should be present. And the example that I wanted to show you was that you have sort of top level categories. There are, I think, around 20 right now, conceptual categories. You open the first one, which is entitled beliefs. And on the first 4 lines of beliefs, you see very mixed bag of things. You see politics. Politics is not necessarily a belief, right? That's a code that contains other codes. So you click deeper, and under beliefs, politics, the lower, let's say, order of the hierarchy, there is a branch of anti-Semitism. And that's the moment when you start thinking, okay, is anti-Semitism as a concept really in the proper ontology from, let's say, thinking about abstract concepts, substantial politics and under beliefs? Yes, it is, and no. Is it helpful in somebody's coding anti-Semitism? Might be. Then you start looking for other anti-Semitisms, and you find other anti-Semitisms. So you found duplicates with the same label, describing the same concepts, being present in multiple branches of the ontology. And here comes the issue. Does it mean anything or doesn't, right? That there are duplicate codes present in different branches. What we tried to do and develop over the years was this. a model of hierarchization,
Don't try to read it. I mean, it's
which basically is trying to
This-
utilize
this-
the placement of the codes in order to give the coders and the readers, the distant readers, close readers, the tool to find the correct meaning. So I'll just like describe the left column because this is where we ended at. So there's the ground layer text. That's literally what's explicitly present in the data. From text, you develop basic abstractions, words, keywords, labels that are mostly, again, directly linked to the nature of the text, but not necessarily represent the meaning yet. And from there on, we started abstracting. So what I'm trying to tell here, and there's the idea of ontologically proper ordering and sorting. And our issue was, okay, people talk about related problems, right? You talk about left wing, being leftish, leftism. In different contexts, how do we want to work with it? So as a result, that's just one example. In our ontology, the Z level, the top level hierarchization has two branches. One of them is ideology, and second one is actions. And we have a category, subcategory of actions for political action, which is voting for left wing. And on the other hand, we have people discussing on expressing tenets of what we might call left-wing ideology.
And they do not say anything about voting, so we don't know how they voted.
Or they can talk about both, and then we code both.
How other people voted. There's no voting. They just say, I love, I don't know, Hitler or some, you know.
Some say that,
Kaczynski,
yeah, some say that.
Babiš.
So the point is that basically by knowing the ontology, knowing the structure of the ontology, you are reproducing the structure in the coding and you are keeping as neat as possible representation of the meaning. So if you happen to have two anti-Semitisms, you are purely aware of the ontological distinction through the vertical abstraction in the hierarchy. So in a way, we try to reduce and reduce and reduce, and we are reducing for 4 years. And we reduced it to,
Particularly the last 6 months.
250 conceptual codes. So
From
after
about 1700,
from
we went
about
from
1700
1700 to 200
where we began.
of X's here.
No, it was 1700 W's / X's. We
Yeah, I mean,
reduced it to
well, yeah.
13 Z's
So
and then other codes underneath that. But our vocabulary right now, if we were, and that was the point, if we were to get somebody who has not been part of the research to analyze code new data, we have a relatively clean 250 codes, let's say, to capture.
we hope.
To capture what we are interested in. So there's, let's say, this horizontal vertical structure of distinctions versus subsumptions in the two dimensions of the ontology. And that's something which we do not really have in currently those claimed 22,000 semantic codes that we have in the VHA ontology, which means that there are numerous overlaps and it's really difficult to use those for any
And just one quick remark is we use the word abduction in a specific sense, somewhat improper perhaps, but it indicates that we go back and forth between the data and theory many rounds, right? So that's kind of marginally related to more technical definitions of abduction, but that's what we're doing. We once we got the preliminary codes, which are purely inductive, we have our research questions, we have our theories, we know where we want to go, what we want to answer, and then we started shaping the codes in the way that it would be easier to provide those answers in a way. So that was simply a mix of bottom up and top down from that point on. Those were purely kind of logical 10 categories, 10 big kind of chunks of whatever, descriptors of reality or something. Now,
and then we have
we just produced that. So it's like
we have
1 hour.
3 sketches, but it's really kind of not relevant what exactly those examples are, and I also think you can't really see the graph in this light. However,
So
what we realized is happening is that we are when we are coding, and this is now this I was talking about this semantic aspect, the structural aspect, sorry. Now here comes the holistic, the interpretive aspect. So there's a point, if I would ask anybody of you, and I experienced it during a workshop last 2 weeks ago, if I were to sit you down, I would give you 8 codes and tell you to code an interview. We would start having an endless conversation about how to apply those codes. What are the dimensions of what do they cover? What's the extension? What's the substance at hand? And we realized that we are moving along basically 3-dimensional space when we were coding and reviewing the codes. And here we can think about it that, let's say, on the first axis here, there's something of a horizontal movement. You're considering, when you know the ontology, if this phenomenon belongs to problems or it belongs to actions. You have already a pre-knowledge of what's the parameters, the properties of the.
So imagine here that there are 10 categories here, like 10 pillars. One of them is called problems, right? So we start to the problem and we think, is it really the problem? Well, before I code, maybe I need to look into ideologies or something, another 9 of them. So in other words, our thinking moves along this axis, right? Between categories.
Yeah.
We simply, we sat down and we started thinking, what the hell are we doing? Let's write it down, how our thinking actually goes. And then we realized that we keep moving along this axis, right?
The second dimension, which is the vertical one, is actually that sometimes when somebody says, yes, my mother was Jewish, you don't need to abstract it. You have literally sort of the named entity type of information that you can directly tag. And if you know that there is some sort of identity code for Jewishness, you don't need to consider other correlated codes.
Here very close to the text.
So
right?
like you move on up and down along the levels of, let's say, abstractions. But then interestingly, what we realized is that what we do a lot, and that's the holistic aspect, the interpretation does not come from that one specific fragment. Very frequently, to be able to properly diagnose, identify, and interpret what somebody says in one fragment, we might need to step out to a broader context. And the broader context can be another fragment, another response answer, contribution to the interview. It can be following up on the previous one or not. We can have a situation which happened to us numerous times that we actually have to think about what we read and heard in the other interviews. You get the communitarian context of what people that are typical supporters of peace mean by saying that. And we actually really literally had to find the meaning of memes, find the meaning of, let's say, abbreviations, nicknames, shortcuts that are present in the specific subculture, the subcommunity. You can't really get the full meaning of the fragment just based on the plain text that you see there. Or the furthest possible level, in order to interpret it, you have to reach out to some socioeconomic data. You have to reach out to something which goes beyond a subculture, a subcommunity. So now the issue is, why we were analyzing 120 interviews for 4 years is precisely this, right? Because here's the thing, if you're pushed to label data and do this kind of like tagging operation, you don't have too much time to consider these issues, right? You need cultural knowledge, deep linguistic knowledge, you need the knowledge of the issue of the problem, and basically those who are analyzing, interpreting, grow with it. So that would be the conclusion of what do we mean by structured, interpretive / holistic coding.
Yeah, so our thinking moves, again, to recap, in along 3 axes. One domain, another domain, another domain, the level of abstraction, and sort of, I guess, the easiest way to describe this dimension is the amount of text to which you go. Sometimes you do not go, if someone says Prague, I'm here. I don't need to think about anything more. I code it at place and that's it. But someone says something about, say, their ideology and it's not entirely clear, then I'm beginning to search for the minimum context within which I will achieve a certain level of confidence to impose a given code. Now, I understand that we have like about 50 minutes. So we wanted to talk about those like specific operations. We have examples, but we will skip that. So you will see that simply for any example, there was a different way of thinking. Sometimes we traveled through all three dimensions. Sometimes we traveled through just two, and so on. Okay, so now the results. So you have, hopefully, right, you have the sense of the method. The semantic network analysis designed to identify those pairs and then broader networks. And then we would most likely, we will not have time, maybe we will, is there are certain techniques of reduction, right? So the first shot with this amount of data, you get this overwhelming cloud of nodes and edges, as they're called, and you don't know anything, right? So you find the different methods of reduction. We wrote about the paper, but for this case, we are just using the simplest one, which is the breadth, which means how many times a given connection has been made in a given community that was studied. So we start.
So there is just one additional point. Jan, you mentioned pairs, and this is what has to be mentioned that contributed to this, right? Because typically when you see semantic networks, they usually are some sort of a big world semantic or social networks that are produced by a lot of data that's nowadays, I would say, mostly produced through let's say a computational analysis of language or text. What we were encoding though, what the result is that you over each fragment encode basically a semantic chain. You encode the phenomena in a specific relationship, and only this combination of relationship that you produce over that fragment makes sense. So these are not in a way random co-occurrences. We know that the co-occurrence has a meaning because we decide to encode the co-occurrence as a whole through the method of holistic analysis. So even though we have a limited data, we do believe that this way of reaching the semantic network is quite robust as it resides on human insight. But yeah, so this is I think the global network of Czech populism.
Yeah, but already reduced. I mean, but whatever I have it down, whatever the D was here, I think 3.
Yeah.
But so at least 3 connections exists. This is the Czech, as we call it, global network. Manipulation is the center. This is the thing that people talk most often about, and it has kind of a lot of associations. Political corruption, Babiš, manipulation, this kind of emerged, but as you will see in the reduced networks in a moment. Now, this is Polish, which, you know, the first thing is peace, the political party. You know, like, right there you have a little essay to write that Czechs do not think in terms of political parties, but think in terms of Babiš. Poland has a kind of semi-dictator, Kaczynski, but he is working in the way that this is behind the scenes, and it's kind of reflected in this. Like the people, this is incredibly powerful node in the network. Manipulation here also appears. Inadequacy of the system appears. But
could I just chip in if you could go back to the previous 2 graphs? So here's the thing. As we work in this world on comparative politics, a lot of things start making sense to us only when we see them in the comparative perspective. And I would say this is the case to maybe mention and talk about that the coloring you see is basically split into sub-communities based on modularity measure of the network. Everybody does that, that's nothing special, but in a way, it helps us pinpoint some differentiating elements which we could consider actually cultural. So here we know, everybody knows it, but we see it here in the network, activization of the discussion around the issues of abortions and female rights. If you would just jump back to the Czech network, Jan, we have very similar issues being dealt with on the surface level of the big network, but here comes a specific discussion of Czech racism, which is discussed in a way as the respondents as cultural feature, and there is a lot actually connected to Roma because of the nature of our data set, but it seems that already we see those issues that we thought would be important or we wouldn't think would be as important as they turned out to be.
So if we go now to core networks, so now the level of reduction is much higher, and then that's the Czech network. So now you see the most powerful frequent edges, co-occurrences. Of course, I mean, there's no way around the fact that, as always, when people generate those visualizations, we can manipulate visualization to make our point. I mean, we could drag any of those points and put it somewhere else, as you know, in these visualizations. So, you know, the fact that we put the corruption in the middle, yeah, it's cute, kind of, but, you know, it is not the most powerful set of edges. But perhaps when, you know, literally it was yesterday that we generated the first graphs, the system started clicking, I mean, after many tweaks. So, you know, but the most powerful edges are, you know, between, again, manipulation, political corruption, Babiš. This one is very powerful about COVID and anti-vaxxers, right? So that of course, what it means that people talk about it. We don't know if they are anti-vaxxers or are angry with anti-vaxxers. That's a separate set of issues that codes that perhaps will reveal that, but they talk about it in the context of manipulation.
There was a question raised, and I think this graph is quite interesting, which was like, okay, you collected interviews during the COVID times, and you're asking people about politics. So will you actually find out anything about politics beyond the COVID, overwhelming the discussion of that period? And first of all, we read the interviews. We both read all the Czech and the Polish interviews several hundreds times, so we know it happens. But on the other hand, what turned out to be quite interesting, you see the sub-community differentiation, right? And really the green parts of the graph, if you look at all the codes present, that's really highly interconnected set of COVID-related codes. However, the issues of political corruptions, elite estrangement, as we called it, which is the so-called vertical, let's say, a crisis of the society that the communists tried, the populists tried to invigorate and use, and Babiš, they are actually predominantly present outside of the COVID discussion in the whole network, if we just look at the sub-communities produced by this metric.
Okay, and this is Poland. So quite a different network with, as we already said, peace in the center dominating everything, it seems. Of course, there you have things that you do not have in the Czech. Manipulation is still here. Political and cultural polarization, cultural and related to ideology, very strong. Catholic Church, obviously, in Poland. Relationship to the main competitor. So the competition is very much reflected between, let's say, kind of liberal and right populist parties. And then, of course, here, and, you know, if we, at a lower level of abstraction, you have a lot of edges here around the issue of abortion and women's rights. And that's the mention of activism. So that was, as you may know, later one of the reasons that most people think that helped the PO to win election against peace was women's anger. Okay, so national identity, something very, very interesting for us. This is very high level of reduction, the Czech national identity with just 4 codes. That's
the step 1 ego network of Czech self-identification, how Czechs speak about Czechs, how they think about themselves. And those are the most dominant elements that are connected. So we probably know something about the Czechs thinking about themselves as very passive socially. There's a lot of debate of what's the impact of the communist regime that was in Czechoslovakia. There's a lot of discussion of the racism, mostly anti-Roma, can be also against any other outgroup. And then surprisingly, without actually us inducing at all, the debate of the rights of LGBTQ plus, non-binary people, trans people came up as a strong issue that actually is more polarizing than the supply side, the politicians would probably even let you know if you look at the mainstream populism.
And here's Poland. So here is, you know, the Polishness is associated with the tradition, Catholic Church, polarization. What is it, Paul?
Center periphery.
Center periphery. That was a surprise, but there's a lot of talk about Poland A and Poland B. So that kind of made it to the people's minds. And then you go through peace again, of course, and then you get to manipulation and
nationalism.
Nationalism. That's when you. There's some reason for those crazy codes, but
we can explain
it is nationalism. We try to keep names in such a way that we'll remember where they belong to those higher level categories, which you can see now. I don't remember. Maybe we'll sidestep national identity with step 2. So the technique is that it allows us to see the most important neighboring network. So there are 2, right? And there's something interesting here, but you know, we definitely want to hear from you. So this is step 2, Polish network, pretty more complex, obviously. And the last thing, very quickly, just ego networks of populism. So you ask the system, just tell me what are the things related to populism. And it is populism is, as anthropologists or linguists call it, an emic rendition. So this is what people define by populism, which may be completely different from the, say, technical definition, the ethic definition that I presented. So this is, again, Czech Republic, associations, co-occurrences with populism, political corruption, economic corruption, both corruptions we coded separately, Andrej Babiš, incompetence, elite estrangement, manipulation, right? Those are the most important things. ANO makes the appearance, finally, in the ego network, and this is peace. It's a Polish ego network of populism. And what is very interesting technically, we would love to have it reduced more, right? And this is 7. When we went to 8, almost all of them disappeared. So there is some kind of issue. Sometimes it may be coincidental, of course, but there is sometimes this feature of the system that literally many of them were co-occurred 7 times and then 8 times no. So it's unfortunate because some of them perhaps would get a better picture, but we will have to stretch it and we will have to sit down and carefully kind of play with the visualization to get, you know, which seems to be this most important edge here, again, to manipulation, peace and manipulation.
And during the project, Jan produced actually a piece with the team that was linking different methods of thinking about conceptual, let's say, abstraction from the point of philosophy, social science, anthropology, and different methods of network reduction. And we know, actually, we experimented with the data that this, like, sort of what seems to be a very linear way of reducing the network, which is the depth layers removal, actually is not really linear. That the most linear drop-off that we tried was Himalayan backbone, but that's a little bit difficult algorithm that actually you can like have to pre-calculate, at least for Gephi, because Gephi doesn't seem to have a plugin for it, which is something that we want to do. So that's just a technical note on the side.
And just the final thing is you know, the economic versus cultural explanations. When you look at it closer, even the colors indicate, here you have cultural, let's call them variables or factors, and here you have economic. Right? Inequality, socio-economic polarization, socio-economic polarization, not cultural polarization, which is, I guess, some image of class divisions socio-economically, and so on. And inadequacy of the whole system, which is, you know, when you read the interviews, it's a common complaint, particularly the healthcare system. So, you know, another separate thing will be healthcare system and ego networks of all remarks, associations with health delivery. I guess that's it. Thank you. It's.
Do you have a final slide?
Oh, we have a final slide. That's the final slide. We didn't produce the slide, which is thank you. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think it was really, as I said at the beginning, different from other talks here. So it may take some time for us to ask appropriate questions, but I do think that there will be appropriate questions from the audience. So the floor is now yours.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. First, I would like to make sure I understand these graphs. So the thickness is basically based on the number of co-occurrences of those two categories within one, what you call a contribution, which is the question and answer. So you basically, if within that answer, those two topics occur, this X1. And the colors are based on the type, like cultural versus economic or something like that.
No, they're calculated. The sub-communities that you see in the graph, the coloring is calculated by a modularity measure, you know, then splitting the graph into sub-communities. So we did not induce.
The system produced colors. We didn't do anything.
Okay. And you had about 150 interviews?
Yeah.
And 120. Okay. And you interpreted as an analysis of the interviewees, but there were also the interviewers. I don't know how many. And I guess they were asking the question. So I would say they contribute to the resulting pictures, perhaps substantially. Have you tried to analyze this? And maybe if you want to interpret it as the interviewees, like building some biases or patterns of each interviewer and trying to subtract them?
Excellent. There are several questions in that one question. That's precisely the problem of qualitative interviewing, right? Because unlike in the survey data, you don't have a battery of questions that are not making any faces and talking to you. You are supposed to fill out scale 1 to 10, right? You know, usually even have an open question. So initially, we had the idea that we would encode the questions as well and maybe create two data sets, maybe try to represent it in the data set. This was the question, this was the answer. We gave up on that, and instead what we did is we used our holistic approach to basically encode the meanings that emerge from the text, from the interaction. So I will give you an example. It happens, right, that if you look only at the answer, and this would be the question if you would parse the data and look only at the answers, don't look at the questions at all, and you would see only the transcripts of the answers. Sometimes you can't really interpret the actual answer while seeing the question. So from our point of view, again, holistically, not labeling the text of the question is okay, because we're not building a labeled data set for language model training. We are encoding networks. So we basically borrowed the context of the question in order to interpret the answer. So we encoded the things. Then the second question is biases. This is the technical matter, how to bring in, let's say, the part of the meaning that's hidden in the question into encoding the answer. Now biases, that's a different issue. So we had two professional, only two, one interviewer per data set. So there is a certain level of consistency that usually you don't get when you have just one person, only that one person, always asking all the questions and interacting with the people, right? And those were both at the time PhD students of ethnography, anthropology. Both of them actually specializing in what we started calling digital anthropology. And they were basically trained and they were exchanging experiences, trying to not introduce any bias. I will, maybe Jan can answer a little bit more about the first thing. We did not specifically ask the people ever about populism. We did not ever induce the topic of populism into the conversation. We have not induced political topics into the conversation. We waited, we, I mean them too, but us as a team, what emerges in this more, how to put it, inductive way into what emerges from the interviews. And then because it's interpretive interviewing and it's like this kind of like qualitative direct interviewing, you can steer the discussion to learn a little bit more. But basically, the people were brought in at the collection of the respondents happened online. Those were people that presented somehow themselves in the online space as having an opinion. They were contacted, they would be willing to provide an interview, and then they were interviewed. And basically there was a touch base point, which is, hey, I've seen you contributing to this conversation on COVID, right? And then the conversation followed. Funnily enough, if you statistically look at the structure of the interviews, there's very little produced on the first, let's say, in the first 5 to 10%. The real conversation that we started encoding that was rich in meanings came throughout the interview. It sort of like builds up. So you can even see that even the touch base point, how did I find you and what do you think about it, was not really the most productive part of the interview. And the interviews, if you imagine that you have an average interview, I mean, this could be, if it was a conversation, they could be 2-3 hour long conversations, you know, so you get a lot of different twists and turns. Jan, do you have something to add?
Well, two things, that they trained together and they had the interview protocol and they asked, they were supposed to exhaust it. So they asked they wanted people to talk about the same topics. So there was no order to that because there was an idea that the conversation should be directed by, to some degree, free flowing, as you know, there's more kind of in-depth interview. And the second thing is, we had the general sort of problem that directed, no doubt, both sets of interviews, which we called well-being, which the questions at the beginning was, what's happening in your life? What are the things that you worry about? What are the problems you have? What are, hence the category Z, problems, is the biggest, right? And is rich. And, you know, which kind of is useful. I mean, that's what our assumption, because people are driven politically by problems, or at least theoretically. Sometimes they go into apathy, but the degree to which each of them exhausted all the topics, we haven't looked at it yet, but it's doable. So we can kind of assess the degree of, I don't know, incompleteness, perhaps. For sure, there will be some, but roughly they kind of talked about the same things. And then there was, no direct questions about politics, but when they volunteered, you know, my father, blah, blah, blah. And then so they would say, and what about you? Like kind of, and then we would get more on sort of some kind of opinion or a view or definition of something political.
Yeah, thank you. Martin, okay? Thank you. This is a sub-question concerning annotators. Were the annotators instructed to assign just one code, or can they be kind of uncertain whether this or that code. So in that case, were they allowed to put two codes, and how did you deal with that situation?
Jan, do you want to answer or?
No, no, kidding. I'm kidding.
All right,
No.
so I will just say, ultimately, the two annotators is the two of us. So the thing is, I would say on the annotations, I would say that I annotated 99%, now 100% of the Czech interviews myself, and Jan did like 30%. Our colleague from Warsaw did another 70%. But now, since we went through all the
Yeah, I reviewed
review rounds, I would say
everything.
me and Jan are the annotators, which was necessary. It was the only way to produce a coherent structure for the codebook. The co-occurrences, if there are ambivalences, we tried to do our best through the coding procedure, I think, to avoid ambivalences where we were not certain that this passes all the criteria. And what the criteria was, is this relevant to our research questions? Which is another thing that we actually can do with this type of interpretive coding. We can tailor what do we annotate in order to actually learn what do we want to learn. So then we, from the pre-annotations, we were deleting all the codes for hobbies, free time activities, who likes to eat what, and where did they travel, if it was not really relevant to actually what we wanted to learn from these more narrowly adapted semantic chains reproduced in the network, which were encoded together in the co-occurrences, where again bringing out the meanings. So this is what we tried.
And
tried to do.
every coding decision was recorded in the spreadsheet. So that spreadsheet has whatever over 2,000 lines. And if we realize that we are in the situation that we are not sure, we would go to the spreadsheet and look at how we did it before. And the spreadsheet had this feature that it had live links. So you clicked on our line, or one element of one column, one cell in the line for a given code, it would take us to the actual text. And we would revisit the text and one more time decide, okay, was it properly done the first time around? Or, if there was like this situation, which would be 3-4 codes, then we would look at all of them. And that's partially what we're trying to explain in that cube, that we kind of traveled to additional information and then made a decision and revised all 4 and returned to so was the second or the third round of coding. This was insane. I mean, but once we started, we thought we need to finish this and go, what else are we going to do? So it took, this last round, over a year.
This is a sub-question. And have you tried to annotate one interview, both of you independently, to see some kind of annotators agreement?
Yeah, we reread everything together. My Polish improved a lot, and Jan's Czech improved a lot, because we were trying to explain and find the middle point to, let's say, confirm to our working definition of the code. And I mean conceptual codes. Most of our codes, if they're not entities, are related to some sort of theoretical explanation or conceptualization of such a phenomenon. This is why it took us such a long time, because with each code we are also referencing the common theoretical approaches to understanding such a phenomenon. So we have descriptions that should allow anybody, to successfully produce it. And I would say that those descriptions also were a product of attempt to produce codes which would hopefully be independent from the cultural context that on the lower levels of abstraction brought them up. So if I think about the W codes which don't exist anymore, our X's should be culturally universal to the extent as much as possible. And this was the magic of the fact that we too, one better and one worse scholar of populism, reading through their cultural lenses and the knowledge of the body of work that everybody did on the topic, those interviews. So in terms of intercoder reliability, we re-encoded all the interviews together. So at each point, we were applying systematically both our sort of reviews in a way to have the highest possible level of consistency and coherence that we could reach. And now we want to throw it a different cultural context. We have, you know,
Still famous.
yeah.
Okay. Any more questions?
Can I ask you a question using this?
No one
No,
from the
sorry. But I have a question since the,
station here? No question? Okay.
okay, is
So-
fake important as a focal point of Czech national culture? Good soldiers fake. Is it a character that's important in the Czech national culture, however we understand? I understand national culture as a set of discourses to which people are exposed within a certain space, you know, following, I guess, most common understanding these days. But in those sets of discourses, there are certain symbols that stand out and are kind of focal symbols or key symbols. I have no doubt that in Poland, it's the Black Madonna of Częstochowa and some kind of heroes of some uprisings, whereas in the Czech case, we come across, for example, Ladislav Holý, an impactful anthropologist, wrote about Czech culture, talks about quite a bit about fake. We don't want to overdo it. It pops up in the interviews, fakeism as a specific mindset. But it is important for us because by contrast to the Polish kind of crazy, romantic, whatever, exuberance and messianism, the Czech seem to be much more pragmatic, right? Which is perhaps a stereotype, but perhaps not. I mean, these are not written in stone features, but tendencies, right? There's no Czech who would bother to figure out who Black Madonna is. But in Poland, if you know, I'm a Protestant. I studied it as from the outside, but as I tell my students, if I don't know who that is or what that is as the symbol, I am so much less Polish, right? So that you can reduce your Czechness or Polishness by removing those common elements that signify something. So we really are not sure. I mean, we found some data, but it's Jara Zimmerman, which is the most famous Czech, which is fantastic, because if it's the case, then in Poland you do not have any fictional characters, only intellectuals create them, but the Poles are much more into like actual people who died on barricades. Does anybody have any opinion on that?
Demanding task. We keep our fingers crossed. Your last word?
Yes, I hope we will not review too many more annotations. But thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that this will be this is the idea that you get once you start working in this community, right? We produced, I would say, at least for some of our code branches on the higher level, we produced an interesting labeled data set in Polish and Czech, which are small languages, which are typically oriented towards, let's say, political science research, attitudes research, cultural research. So along with the codebook, and I don't know about a codebook that would be managed in such a way available for future data labeling or like qualitative coding. We hope that beyond the scope of researching Czech and Polish populism, those will be tools that might be useful for somebody in the future. So you will find them in the Lindat repository after we're done with it.
Yeah, and we will try definitely train a machine to get to larger, and it should work theoretically because of the instructions seem to be relatively precise. So we'll see how it goes, but we definitely will try. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.